Howdy everybody. Well, it is finally here. Probably the most important director's take yet. The Overwatch team finally addressing 6v6 officially. Now before I get into this, I do want to set some expectations for myself and, anybody else watching. By the end of this, I don't think that they are going to be saying, alright, next season, we're going to push 6v6, we're going to hard focus, we already have all of this content, so throughout the next season, we're just going to go hardcore 6v6. I doubt that they would do something like that. It would be cool, but I don't think that's very realistic. What I'm hoping for at the end of this is, just for them to be honest with us about the issues of 5v5, the poor decisions that they made that, brought 6v6 and Overwatch 1 into the poor state that it was before they switched everything to Overwatch 2. And I hope that they, address and acknowledge 6v6 as a real solution for a lot of the game's issues and are open to, changing the format in some way. Even if it's not all the way into 6v6, just addressing the format and the current pain points of the asymmetrical format we're stuck in right now is so important for the game going forward. Because it's in a rough spot right now, considering retention and player sentiment. And in the industry as a whole, Overwatch 2 is seen as a major dishonest failure from Blizzard. And I hope throughout this DevBlog they can acknowledge solutions, meet us genuinely, and give us a plan forward. So, without any further ado, let's get into this. Alright, director's take. Opening up the conversation on 5v5 and 6v6. Finally. Hey everyone, there's been a lot of talk about 6v6 lately, and it's only intensified in recent weeks since we posted our latest director's take and made a Twitter post with a promise to talk about it in the future. Well, now is the future, and this is that next piece. So let's get into it. Wait, let's not get into it quite yet. This is a pretty complex and nuanced topic, and it gets to the beating heart of what makes this game tick. Our players have different opinions and preferences about the ideal number of players in an Overwatch match. And so does our team. We are a microcosm of the broader community and discuss this internally. I'm hoping that this piece will serve as an introduction to our own discussions and a jumping off point to engage with all of you. I'd also like to set a few expectations and ground rules. First, it's a pretty long. Creators are going to lose their voices reading this one aloud. Probably I've got some water and coffee on the side, just in case. So if you'd like a TLDR, the what's next section should suffice. Secondly, I'm not here to tell you what you ought to like or even what's empirically better. This is a game and your preference for fun is relative to your own taste, ability, and experience. Lastly, there are years of decisions that affect such a fundamental piece of Overwatch. Some of you might be intimately aware of these, while others might not be. Before diving in, I'd like to set the stage and give some context on some of the larger changes to the game that ultimately culminated in the 5v5 format we have today. Alright, little history lesson for the newer players. There have been 3 large format changes to Overwatch, and the first happened shortly after the game launched. This was hero limits. There could be any number of a particular hero on one team. You could have 6 Genjis or 6 Reinhardts, and if my memory serves me right, the winner of Team 4's first internal tournament was 1 Winston and 5 Zenyatas. We called it the Quinston. Zenyatta orbs stacked with no cap to healing at the time. It was glorious and terrifying. During our early development, it was necessary to have duplicate heroes per team. Our first core combat milestone only had 4 heroes, because there were 4 roles. As the roster grew, this was no longer necessary, and it also introduced issues. Overwatch heroes have very distinct kits with impactful abilities. Stacking abilities could be fun, but it posed challenges to balancing many of these abilities in-game. People reference double barrier, but back then you could have 6. Imagine cycling 60 mortality fields. See, that's where it gets spooky. Just like with Quinston, it's almost like supports have a history of breaking tanks that would otherwise be fine and have counterplay. The number of team compositions and strategies available was huge. The variety was great, but we didn't feel like we could ever truly balance the game without severely watering down our heroes. So we made the choice to impose a limit of one of each hero per team. This essentially solved the issue of ability stacking, but it did have a few side effects. It traded some of the creativity in putting together team compositions for a more consistent and balanced experience. It also took away some choice from players. If someone wanted to play Tracer, but you were already Tracer, they would be unable to. A theme of this, and future decisions, was limiting match variety, as well as player freedom and creativity, in order to create a more balanced, consistent, and competitive experience for players. Remember this point, because we'll touch on it a few more times in this piece. I think the hero limit rule was a great decision, I agree, and we would make it again. The other two large format changes have a lot of positive benefits, but are nowhere near as clear cut. The second large change to the game's format was the move from open queue to roll queue, that should be roll lock, because we don't have a true roll queue right now. The difference between a roll lock format and a roll queue format is that in roll lock you are guaranteed your role and you can only choose characters of that role. Where in roll queue it's more of the MOBA system where you choose a lane or a position on a team and you can choose any of the characters, but you have to fulfill the responsibilities of that team. Otherwise you're considered throwing and thus reportable. I think I'm just going to refer whenever they say roll queue as roll lock throughout this, because it's more honest to the situation that we have right now. From open queue to roll queue, which limited team compositions to 2 heroes from each role. Before roll queue, there was no enforced 2-2-2 team composition, and players had the freedom to select any role they liked once they loaded into a match. With open queue, teams had a lot of freedom about what heroes and team compositions to play, but there were quite a few problems that roll lock intended to address. Prior to implementing roll lock, there was a stark imbalance in the number of players playing each role within a match. Well, there are a lot of factors contributing to that. Damage was, by far, and still is today, the most popular role. And tank was, by far, the least popular. That can be attributed to the individual role issues, but mostly that's a roster imbalance issue. I doubt they do acknowledge it, because they've yet to in the history of Overwatch for the most part. But a big factor in the huge disparity of queue times is the insane roster imbalance we have. It wasn't bad way back whenever we had tank, defense, offense, and support, because it was more even. But whenever they made the decision to combine the defense and offense roles into the damage role, they didn't do their due diligence to rework certain characters, because like a lot of the defense characters could have just been turned into tanks or supports to help even out the roster. But the old Overwatch team seemingly didn't really care about that at the time, because they went ahead and just smashed those two roles together and ended up making a huge imbalance of what players were choosing. And in a hero shooter like Overwatch, players are going to play whichever role is the easiest to get into and whichever role has the most characters, because not only is it easy to get into and understand the value that you're giving as a damage hero in a shooter, but there's also way more characters for people to relate to and get into their hero fantasy. So of course, the role that is the easiest to get into, the easiest to see your value and improvement in, and also has the most characters with the most diverse identities, is going to see the most players. And it really is crazy, because it's better today with the actions they've taken in staggering the new character releases, because there's way more tanks and way more supports than we had back in Overwatch 1. But we still have almost double the damage heroes than we do the other roles. And back in Overwatch 1, you quite literally had more damage heroes than the other two roles combined. which of course is going to lead to extreme queue time issues whenever you try and force an even amount of roles to be represented in a team. They really needed to do their due diligence, and I'm surprised that instead of doing more minor reworks to hero identities and evening out the roster, they decided to just cut a tank off and call it a day for that short-term queue time benefit. Damage is the most popular role, and that is completely fair to say and completely realistic. But one of the, they have to acknowledge that one of the major reasons that it is years of bloat to the number of characters in that role and the ease of access for new players. And by contrast, tank is one of the hardest, if not the hardest role to get into, especially because the value of a tank isn't just kills or seeing the HP bar of your allies go up. It's controlling space and mitigating damage, which a lot of the time isn't completely clear to new players. So it's a harder role to get into that requires a lot more game sense to, realize and improve at and realize the value that you're getting and the mistakes that you're making. And on top of that, it also had less characters than the damage role and didn't have the set audience of people that normally enjoy a support role in these kinds of games. So I think it is technically true to say, but they aren't acknowledging the long-term situation that created this issue and still persists to this day. That has just been compounding for years. But anyways, let's get back into it. This role imbalance frequently led to wildly imbalanced matches between teams. The game played better when heroes from all three roles were selected. The disparity caused social issues as players would try to pressure others into playing tank or the support roles, even when they didn't want to. It made balancing heroes more difficult, since we couldn't balance around a certain role ratio for each team, which is how you get things like Brig, and you expected Brig to just be the only support picked whenever she was released. And it even made introducing new heroes more difficult, since any new hero kit had to take in consideration hundreds of different team compositions and abilities that could overlap with it. The move to role lock was aimed to mitigate these challenges, and it did, but then the old team failed to balance or do its due diligence entering that format, so it became extremely problematic very quickly. Moving to role lock solved many of these issues and added some additional benefits to the game as well. With role lock in place, matchmaking is based on skill within a given role, not just skill overall. Sip some coffee here. Some players have wildly different skill ratings per role, so the ability to matchmaker in said roles provides a big, measurable boost in match quality. That is true, but you also have the added side effect of players within skill ratings not understanding the other roles as much as they do the role that they're queuing. Role lock also solidified the identity of each role, and the fantasy of doing that role's job became clearer. However, the switch to the role lock system did have some downsides, the largest of which was longer queue times, because y'all did literally zero due diligence going into the alternative format. Prior to role lock, the matchmaker just needed to find 12 players of similar skill levels in order to put matches together. After role lock, it needed to find 4 players of each role to make a match. The total number of players queuing has no effect on this. It's almost solely governed by the ratio of people queuing for the least popular role, which is true. Given the game's lower relative ratio of players queuing for tank because of roster imbalance and poor player experience due to poor balance and game-wide decisions, then other damage and support roles, queue times went way up. We'll go into the details on this later. Please do. The team tried to address the imbalance in various ways. We introduced a priority pass system that was a complete failure and just expedited the issue, that gave players who played low-demanded roles, tank, a shorter queue when they switched to damage. This had a positive effect for several weeks, short term, and its influence quickly faded. We also introduced systems to reward players for playing tank, eventually giving them a loot box and a bunch of XP for queuing that role. None of these were able to put a dent in the demand for playing DPS. That is because it did not fundamentally address the issues that were plaguing Overwatch 1 tank. The abundance of CC, the stacking and effectiveness of AoE healing and powerful support sustained cooldowns, no roster adjustments, and Sigma being released to usher in and be the poster boy of one of the worst ongoing metas of all time that was never properly balanced out. Damage queue times drifted a bit lower over time, but much of this was due to the introduction of the open queue competitive mode and the permanent loss of damage players unwilling to wait that long for a match. There were additional drawbacks with role lock. I mentioned earlier that many of our decisions made improvements to the game at the cost of match variety and player freedom. Team compositions were now locked to 2-2-2. This was another step to a more consistent experience within Overwatch, but sometimes consistency can start to feel samey, especially when you don't balance your game. There were some pretty exciting metas in the pre-role lock world, and swapping to a hero of a different role mid-match was often a much bigger change and more exciting than swapping to one of the same role. Like hero limits, role queue took away a part of the freedom in selecting heroes that served as the base of Overwatch. I often wonder if the success of it is as cut and dry as that of hero limits. It's not, unfortunately, because more needed to be done to make that change work, and it wasn't. Could there be an in-between version that softens the original problems without completely solving them, and also isn't quite as restrictive as our current role lock system? A bit more on that later. That's promising. The third major format change. These challenges, as well as longer queue times, led us to the third and most recent major format change to the game, the shift from 6v6 to 5v5. This is almost a blog within a blog, but we're going to cover three things. Why we switched, queue times after the switch, and what the team thinks about 6v6. Are they going to admit that queue times were a major factor in switching and not hide behind the gameplay reasoned excuse? Let's see. Here we go. Why we switched to 5v5. There are many reasons behind the transition to 5v5. When we launched Overwatch 2, we talked about the greater individual agency that players could have in 5v5. Overwatch is a team sport, and it requires players to rely on each other to be successful. This was even more of the case previously, and the game could be frustrating if your team is out of sync. Many times, fights in 6v6 couldn't resolve until ultimate abilities came online. That's very similar to now with all of the power creep. Correct that until ultimate combos could be executed to break through 2 tanks worth of mitigation supported by high uncontested healing output. This can be broken on its own. This is contestable. This is the part that breaks it. It is always the sustain behind the tanks and the large HP pools. We've seen that in every single problematic meta, and they really need to acknowledge it. The world of 6v6 could have really high highs and really low lows. One of the design goals of 5v5 was to try to raise that floor, even though it was at the expense of some of those high moments. Overwatch 2 also has a greater emphasis on FPS gameplay. That is extremely debatable. Because I don't know about you, but I don't think it is more FPS to just AFK shoot at an unkillable tank, and for practically nothing to die until multiple abilities stack or ultimates come into play. I think it's much more FPS to be able to shoot a lower HP tank and punish them for mistakes and kill them, or kill somebody else in a duel off to the side of the normal fight. There's less damage mitigation in CC, less hard CC, just as much CC in total, and more damage mitigation, especially for supports, and stronger mitigation from the tanks. So that's just untrue. And players get to shoot at enemies more. Crowd control could take players out of the game for extended periods of time, especially when they were chained back to back. A 5-second Sombra hack, May Freeze on a primary, Brig Bash, Honest Sleep, Orisa Halt, and Sigma Rock could all happen consecutively to one player. And that is why people didn't like playing tank, especially whenever they're trying to learn it. Typically, a tank who could often survive this onslaught, at least in game, though their real-life mental health was another story, which is why people were dropping the role, because those problems persisted for ages. And the CC and sustain creep just continuously made the tank experience worse and worse. on top of having an imbalanced roster. Damage heroes often complained that their role was the least impactful relative to the strength of the super powerful tank synergies. You really need to put super in there? Okay. And support heroes undoing their playmaking, otherwise known as support denial and synergies. So if you're going to use buzzword for one, try to use the buzzword for the other, but that's a nitpick. The emphasis on ability cooldown management, ult tracking, shooting barriers instead of players, and not a big enough timing windows to just shoot enemies and get eliminations were all factors that contributed to this feeling. Yeah, it feels awful to be a DPS and for nothing to die, and for all of those defensive cooldowns to practically have no downtime. Support heroes also had to focus exclusively on healing since there were bigger team health pools and more incoming damage on the field with the additional tank player. So, in Overwatch 2, we decided to increase everybody's HP pools, especially the tank, so that they are just as strong as so that they are even stronger than 2 Overwatch 1 tanks and have more effective HP. Like, you'll see the issue, you acknowledge the issue, and then you just recreate the issue in a different environment. So that it's the same problem and the same pain points all over again. In 5v5, they have more agency to add some damage or duel other heroes. Arguable, because space is much easier to take and much more difficult and risky to contest. Tank synergy wasn't always fun. It slowed down the game, much like healing, and stabilized it, but sometimes it absolutely ground it to a halt. People point to the double shield meta as an example of this. It wasn't just about double shields though. The ability to stack a very defensive heavy, sustain lineup, especially in game modes that required a team to push through a small choke, caused a lot of matches to feel like there was no progress at all. The game is faster now, and it doesn't typically stall out. Instead, it snowballs wildly. It feels like there is more room to move around a map without the need to earn every inch of it, because teams, and especially tanks, can't effectively contest those off angles. In 5v5, fights are often less focused on moving around in a death ball formation, and there's more room to take angles, flank, and duel other players, which brings in more of the FPS gameplay. While 6v6 can have high moments, it's also hard to follow. Tracking 9 other plays is easier than 11. There are fewer visual effects on screen. That is debatable, there's extreme visual clutter. The 5v5 to 6v6 change really did nothing, because, I mean, any new player looking at everything going on is still going to be overwhelmed, especially during big team fights. Overwatch is a pretty demanding game, and moving to 5v5 made it a bit more cognitively manageable. Very, very minor improvement. Lastly, one of the biggest benefits of 5v5 was dramatically reduced queue times. Let's explore that. So they're going to admit that the queue times were a big reason for 5v5, instead of just hiding behind it being solely for gameplay reasons. Queue time data and context. Hopefully they admit the roster imbalance here. The chart below shows ranked play queue times per role after the introduction of role queue to Overwatch in 2019, compared to queue times per role in Overwatch 2's 5v5 role lock format. As you can see, the shift to 5v5 role lock dramatically reduced queue times for players in all roles, and most notably the damage role, which is still the most popular role, because there is still more characters in there, and it is still fundamentally the easiest role to get into as a newer player. You know, the thing is that, of course, whenever you cut one of the most important requirements in half, of course the queue times are going to improve. So it's kind of like a given, it's more of like a gotcha, and less of like a strong point. Well, let's take a look at this graph here. 7.6 minute average for competitive, 2.9 in Overwatch. Yeah, look at how extreme this is. Like, the difference here is literally half, because you cut out one of the players. And this is a more than double decrease, because the roster is so imbalanced. It's crazy. And it's more in line you can see that this is more than just the players behind it and liking it. This is a compounding of issues causing such an extreme disparity in queue time. And even in Overwatch 2, it's still double the amount because they have so many more characters. They really do need to acknowledge that and make an effort to even out the rosters so that they can look at, they can even have a chance at healthy queue times. Because they still really don't. At least, even if you did just do the stupid move and just snapped a finger to bring the 6v6 back with no changes, doubling the current DPS queue time still isn't as bad as Overwatch 1. So we know that for sure. Alright, back into the actual blog. The biggest factor driving the difference between Overwatch and Overwatch 2 queue times is the ratio of players queuing for each role. We hear players speculate that long queue times are a result of not enough players playing Overwatch. That isn't the case. Well, it was during the content drought, but that's not here or there. The game's supported now. But instead, that relative to all the other roles, players generally queue tank less because it had a poor experience, and there's way more of the other characters, leading to longer wait times for all while we wait for a tank to free up to find a proper match. So in practice, the actual ratio of players queuing for tank, damage, support is much closer to the current 1-2-2 format than the previous 2-2-2 format. As a result, the 5v5 role-lock format better mirrors actual player interest in each role, and making the switch resulted in shorter queues. You can say role representation, but the player interest is just so skewed because of the reasons I've already gone over, that it's really hard to gauge that until you actually have, a good experience in each role and a similar number of heroes in each role with different playstyles. The sharp drop-off in queue times in October 2022 is when Overwatch 2, along with 5v5, shipped. The queue times of all heroes dropped and are now much shorter than they were in the 6v6 world. In the abandoned 6v6 world. This is almost all because the game required one less tank in a match. If you look at the current queue times, you can see that there is still a lack of tanks compared to our other roles. Just flipping the switch and returning to 6v6 would likely cause a return to the previous queue times or worse. It wouldn't be worse, but yes, like I said just a little while ago, just stupidly flipping the switch and making no fundamental changes to the roster and gameplay experience or balance would be inherently negative. But in no way would it be worse than when the game was abandoned, simply because the game is actually supported now. Regardless of the amount of players in game, queue times are always reflective of how many people are queued per role. In other words, the main driver of increased queue times is the ratio of players queued at each role. Since there are less players playing as a tank, queues would likely go back to the way they were before. But nowhere near as bad, because the game is supported, and there's more tanks. Take a sip of coffee before getting into this one. Thoughts on 6v6. The game started its life with 6 players on each team. I discussed why we moved away from 6v6, but that doesn't mean it's without any merit. There were moments in madness that could happen with 12 players in a match that just don't quite coalesce when there are 10. It was almost too much to keep track of. Correction, it was too much to keep track of at times, and that was part of the charm. There are big moments in Overwatch 2, but they don't quite leave that same chaotic, over-the-top feeling to them. It's not as fun. Part of the chaos allowed players to be less pressured in a match. There was an extra player to take up a bit of the slack for someone who was performing poorly. And since that player was a tank, they had quite a lot of impact. Whereas in 6v6, you can cover for a tank that's performing poorly, because a 5v6 is much more realistic to win. In Overwatch 2, a 4v5 is much less likely for you to win, and if that's a tank, it's just 90% of the time not happening. There were a lot more hit points and defensive capabilities to burn through. Maybe that was true at the launch of Overwatch 2. That is no longer true. We have more HP now, and much stronger defensive capabilities now, so that point is unfortunately very dishonest, which had a stabilizing effect on gameplay. Teams could fold a bit slower than they do now. We went over some of the issues of tank synergy earlier, but having 2 of them allowed one to focus on protecting their backline, while the other held ground or pushed into the enemy team. There was an actual fun dynamic. The tank role had a lot of depth and understanding how to work with the other tank on the team, which was, the fun and interesting part of improving and learning the game. This part of the mastery curve took a long time to learn, and for the smaller group of people devoted to it, that was part of its allure. We mentioned the difficulty in balancing takes for 6v6 earlier, but the past year and a half has showed us that there are major issues with balancing tanks for 5v5 as well. For much of Overwatch 2, tanks have been fairly balanced. But despite that, when one of them becomes a powerful outlier, like Mauga, that can be felt strongly in the world of one tank. What's next? Okay, that was a lot of setup. I think I've put more into this in the essay I wrote in college, so where do we go from here? At the end of the day, we want to make the game that players want to play. And there are a large portion of players that want to play 6v6. Or genuinely we just want the game to be better. Because of the challenges mentioned previously, we are focused on making 5v5 the best experience that it can be. Alright, so we are still going to prioritize 5v5 in the near future. However, because we operate as a service to our players, we always remain open-minded to reevaluating our decisions based on your reactions and feedback, to give you the best game experience we can. Rather than introduce a disruptive, permanent change to the game, we'd prefer to explore the space further and make changes based on that exploration. Good, because we need to do this right. With that said, we're looking at running a series of events to try out different core team composition formats in Overwatch 2. Very interesting. The community has just once or twice suggested a test. Why not put various forms of 6v6 into the game in order to gauge the results? We agree, and based on your feedback, we're exploring how we can test different forms of 6v6 in the game to gauge the results. This is taking some time, however, for reasons that may not be readily apparent. My guess is optimization, balance is a big one. They're not going to do it, but shifting the roster, the same things I've been going over this entire time. The first and honestly largest reason is the need to do this in a way that allows the game to have optimized tactical performance, I'm referring to frame rate and memory constraints, with 12 players in a match. There have been quite a few upgrades and additions to Overwatch 2 that have an impact on the performance of the game. These range from new features like Allied Outlines and enabling healer vision by default, the addition of more technically demanding hero kits, as well as upgrades to upgrade is arguable to the UI there. Heroes and maps. In a 6v6 setting, these upgrades have significant impacts on our players, causing the game to underperform on older systems. It is very sad, but the Switch 2 is coming, so maybe that's whenever they can, leave the Switch behind. Because the Switch 2 should be about as strong as a PS4 or an Xbox One, if not a little stronger. So at that point, everybody's on the same playing field. And before you get mad at me saying that, I played Overwatch 1 on the Switch. When I really got into the game, it was just before Rollock. And I played through, the vast majority of the content drought with my friends on the Switch. And I was a main tank, so I know the issues there. Thankfully it was on console, so there wasn't as much pressure to play double shield, but I still had to face it all the time. So I know that even though it wasn't perfect, Overwatch 1 did function on the Switch perfectly fine. And with proper optimization, I believe you could get it to work on the Switch, but if you really can't, it is sad, but you just need to really consider, is the Switch player base worth tanking the game for literally every other platform? Especially when there's a successor coming out that you could just encourage people to move to and support on the Switch. It's sad, there would be an uproar about it, but realistically here, are we really going to limit the game as a whole just to be on the Switch? Anyway, let's get back into it. Overwatch is a fast-paced game, and maintaining a game that runs smoothly across all our platforms is important to the player's experience. While a limited time test could arrive sooner, interesting, maybe a hacked or arcade event, the team is still investigating exactly how long it would take to permanently increase performance across the game. This would be a large effort and would most likely take at least several seasons to accomplish. That is a very reasonable time frame. Another issue, and one that still gives me anxiety about opening this Pandora's box, is what to do with queue times if enough players prefer 6v6 to keep some form of it around. The team was not able to solve these issues previously because you did almost everything exactly perfectly wrong. You did not alter the roster, you introduced the priority pass system, you didn't balance the game, you introduced incredibly bloated heroes. The old Overwatch team did everything they could to fail, it seems. It really is crazy. But with this new team and their willingness to listen compared to the old team, we could actually solve those issues because a lot of them were solvable, especially all of the balance ones. While we have some ideas now, there's no guarantee that they will work. Is there a world where people are willing to live with long queue times to play this format? For competitive, absolutely. So many people have quit, and so many people want 6v6 that, take the game seriously. Maybe, but that's a pretty risky move to take. That's fair. We also have tens of millions of new players that have only played 5v5. RIP to those new players, honestly. We want to be openly mindful, not to frustrate those who like the game as it is today. The outcome of these tests would give us a lot of valuable information to consider moving forward. We'd run the test for a few weeks, that's really good, long test, and gauge interest from the community. Then we'd measure the impact it had on the other experiences in Overwatch 2, like 5v5, arcade, etc. We'd take the lessons from this playtest to see what we can learn about the mode within the current game ecosystem, which is in a bad state, for the future of Overwatch. We would reflect carefully on the learnings from whatever test we run and explore how to best give players what's being asked for. Whether that's a world of 5v5, 6v6, or even both, is for future us to figure out. And that is really interesting, because that's been one of my takes pretty much since the start of Overwatch 2, is we could very realistically have both formats. A lot of the balance changes for 6v6 are universal. Just good. Good balance for 6v6 can work in most formats that are symmetrical. So I could see a world where you have Role Queue or Role Lock 6v6 as the main competitive game mode, that everything is balanced around, and then alternatively, you have 5v5 Open Queue that is much more freeform, much more deathmatchy as an alternative, fun, less serious mode to get into. And I really do think that both of those could coexist and be really good for the community, honestly. More options is better. More variety is better. I'm going to jump on the soapbox here for a moment. When you look at the changes to Overwatch since its inception, it's clear that many of those have reduced some of the variety within an Overwatch match. We get feedback from some of the players that Overwatch can feel the same game to game. While much of this gets attributed to 5v5, we feel that there is more to play here. There is more at play here. Besides running experiments with 6v6, we'd like to run some that re-examine the ways we tried solving previous problems. Great, because some of those are tremendous, epic failures. Specifically with the goal of bringing some of the freedom back to an Overwatch match without the severity of issues that accompanied it. For instance, we think that there could be other ways of putting a team together that aren't quite as rigid as a set composition, but not as loose as Open Queue. SVB is going to be eating with the the Open Queue role limit, probably. But a true role queue like an MOBA would also be really nice. We'll be running at least one quick play hacked based on this idea in Season 13, and please more. Longer test, please. There are some gotchas to this direction, but after reading 400 pages of this blog, I hope you're all able to see that there are trade-offs to many decisions that go into this game. In any game, really. And that is very true. Anybody who's saying that 6v6 magically fixes everything, if you just snap your fingers and go back to it, is dead-ass delusional. But there are a hell of a lot of things that it does improve, and most importantly, it sets a better foundation, along with going into really any symmetrical format, setting a better foundation for the game to exist and be improved upon. Alright, to wrap it up for now, your feedback has driven both our inspiration and commitment to testing new ideas in game. We want to be super thoughtful about how we implement new ideas into the live game because there are millions of players who jump into Overwatch each season, and we want anything we put into the game to benefit the community as a whole. Ultimately, the Overwatch team wants to continue building the game that you want to play season after season. This blog, or thesis rather, is just the start of the conversation, and that's good. This isn't the last time we're going to be going into 5v5 or 6v6, but we can't wait to share more of our plans in the future. In closing, we appreciate you so much, and we love seeing your passion and dedication to the game. Team 4 and the Overwatch community. The team hears you, we see you, and we're incredibly thankful to be on this ride with all of you. Can't wait to share more in the upcoming months, and let's make a great game together. Well, that was a really good DevBlog. And that's nice, because this is very much so one of the most important DevBlogs ever. I just want to say, I don't think anybody from the Overwatch team is going to see this, but just speaking to my community as a whole, just let them know that we reciprocate, and that we are, we're thankful that they've made the effort to speak to us genuinely. They didn't acknowledge everything that they should have, but they were honest with us and, talked about a lot of the pain points that we've brought up. And they are going to be willing to try everything out, and 6v6 in some form will be returning to the game. So that's very exciting news. And I'm on top of that, I'm very excited to see what alternatives to Rollock they cook up. So a lot to look forward to, and honestly, it's very nice because this, regardless of the current state of the game, this is something to look forward to and have hope about, which the Overwatch community has been lacking for a long while now, at least since the cancellation of PvE. So I'm really happy that this came out and that, it was what it was. It wasn't just a nothing burger dismissing the community so that the devs could sit on top of a podium and, stroke off their ego. They want this game to work as much as we do. And even though we don't see eye to eye, and a lot of their changes are questionable, what's left of the dev team cares too. And that is very important and very relieving to know. But anyway, that's my read-through and reaction. I look forward to all of the changes that they're going to make. I'm probably going to go into I'm probably going to do a follow-up video to this, just summarizing everything and going over some of the incorrect talking points. But all in all, a really good dev blog. I'm glad they acknowledged it and addressed the community as a whole. And I can very much so say that I am excited for the future of this game right now. I'm hopeful even. But that's about it. Please let me know down below what you think. I definitely want to get a discussion going on about this. This is such a big talking point that I definitely want to hear many more opinions other than my own. But other than that, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, subscribe, and I genuinely thank all of you for watching. See ya.